Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are taking a fascinating, highly objective, and clinical look at human attraction. We're going to be specifically focusing on the anatomy of adult women, really trying to understand how our minds wire themselves to appreciate very specific physical forms.
Hey there, I'm going to talk about partialism and how it revolves around human girls' bums, shapes and sizes, and how it acts as a sexual attraction. Let's get to it. Now, while it's super easy to just write this off as a common cultural obsession, in psychology, this intensely focused sexual attraction is actually a well-documented phenomenon with real science behind it. We're going to rely entirely on the structural science to guide us through today.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap, taking us from a broad psychological concept down to specific anatomical geometry and clinical thresholds. We'll be covering 1. Intro to partialism, 2. Common anatomical focuses, 3. The geometry of attraction, 4. The 5 distinct shapes, and finally, 5. Preference versus paraphilia.
Number 1. Intro to partialism. So, to really understand attraction, we first have to define our clinical baseline. Partialism, basically, is a sexual attraction that is intensely focused on a specific non-genital part of the body, rather than the person as a whole or their genitals. Notice that key distinction there. It's all about non-genital anatomical features. The intense focal point of arousal is centered almost entirely on one particular part. Number 2. Common anatomical focuses. Let's move to and see how this builds, from our basic definition to some real-world examples of where this attraction is actually directed.
Right, so common focuses include things like feet, hair, hands, legs, and eyes. But honestly, an intense love for girls' or women's buttocks, often referred to as bums, is a perfect textbook illustration of partialism in practice. It's an incredibly common focus.
Moving on to number 3, the geometry of attraction. Because just like preferring, say, a certain hair color or eye color, people actually have highly distinct aesthetic preferences when it comes to the specific anatomy of the buttocks.
And this brilliantly illustrates how 3 specific biological factors, pelvic structure, glute muscles, and fat distribution, work together. It's literally like an architectural foundation. These 3 things combine to create distinctly different geometric profiles.
All right, number 4, the 5 distinct shapes. You see, plastic surgeons and body geometry experts actually use those exact biological factors we just talked about to categorize shapes into very specific clinical types.
And there are exactly 5 of them. 5 main anatomical categorizations for buttock shapes. We're going to break down the structure and science of every single one right now.
First up, we have the round shape. Clinically, this is the O shape, but you've probably heard it called a bubble. The defining characteristic here? The fat is distributed completely evenly across both the upper and lower cheeks. That perfectly even distribution of volume is what creates that highly curvy, circular appearance.
Next is the heart shape, sometimes referred to as the A shape or the pear shape. Think of the geometry here. You have a much narrower waist that noticeably widens out at the hips. The visual contrast is key. The volume is mostly concentrated at the bottom, specifically in those lower cheeks and upper thighs.
Then we have the square, also known as the H shape. This one presents a much boxier look compared to the first 2. The main biological marker here is a relatively straight, perpendicular line running straight from the hip bone all the way down to the outer thigh. Fourth is the V shape, or inverted shape. As you might guess, it's wider at the top near the waist and becomes narrower at the bottom. It creates this inward angling look where the pelvis and hips just sort of angle inward toward the center as you move down. And finally, the flat shape, sometimes called the I shape or pancake. This profile is all about minimal projection away from the body. It's highly typical on very thin frames or just on individuals who have a much lower overall body fat percentage.
Number 5, preference versus paraphilia. Now, having a strong aesthetic preference for any of those 5 shapes we just went through, totally normal. But in psychology, there is a distinct clinical line where that preference crosses into something else.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how partialism is actually classified as a paraphilia in psychology and psychiatry under some very specific conditions. A paraphilia happens when a specific sexual interest, like say an intense focus on one of those buttock shapes, shifts to become the primary or even exclusive source of arousal, or if it starts causing the person actual distress.
So the crucial point is the threshold, right? A strong physical preference is just an everyday, normal aesthetic desire. You might simply really love the round or heart shape. But clinical paraphilia means that specific anatomical preference has intensified so much that it's now the exclusive driver of sexual interest or it's actively causing personal distress. That intensity and exclusivity are what cross the psychological boundary.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. On the vast spectrum of human attraction, where exactly does a strong physical preference end and a clinical paraphilia begin? It's a brilliant look at the complex, highly subjective boundaries of psychology, aesthetics, and human desire. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.